Jason had always been the kind of person who sought adventure in every corner of the world. Whether it was hiking through rugged mountains, diving into deep seas, or exploring ancient ruins, he craved the thrill of new experiences. But one day, as he was scrolling through his phone, something caught his eye. He saw a picture of the royal palace of a small country known for its extravagant wealth and strict laws. What made the palace even more interesting to Jason was the image of the royal guards standing stiff and tall, their eyes scanning the surroundings with an unflinching focus. The guards looked like they belonged to another world. They were disciplined, stoic, and held an air of mystery. Jason had always admired the idea of strict traditions, the kind that seemed to have been frozen in time. So when he found out that he would be traveling to that very country, it was as if fate had granted him the ultimate opportunity for a real adventure. He couldn't wait to witness the grand palace up close, to see the royal guards in action, and perhaps even try to push the limits of what he could do there. To Jason, this wasn't just a vacation. It was a test, a chance to do something that would make the trip unforgettable. The day he arrived, Jason was immediately struck by the country's deep respect for its history and traditions. Everything from the ancient architecture to the well-maintained gardens seemed designed to remind visitors of the country's proud heritage. Jason, however, was more interested in the palace and its surroundings, particularly the royal guards he had seen in so many photos. He had heard about how these guards were not just part of the country's history, but were also trained to uphold its honor. It was their job to ensure the safety of the royal family, and they took their duty very seriously. Jason felt that this, in itself, was a test of sorts, a test of courage and respect. Jason's curiosity soon got the best of him. He knew he wasn't supposed to get too close to the royal palace, but that didn't stop him. As he walked around the palace grounds, he saw the guards standing still in their uniforms, their eyes scanning the surroundings with absolute precision. They were like statues, but Jason knew they were far from being inanimate. He wanted to get closer, maybe even snap a few pictures with them, to capture a moment that no one else had been able to. But as Jason got nearer, something inside him started to stir. The guards weren't just statues. They were real, living people with a powerful sense of duty. And in that moment, something clicked inside Jason's mind. He wasn't just going to take pictures. He wanted to be noticed. He wanted to push the limits of what he could do. What if he did something that would make the guards react? Something no one had ever tried before. He couldn't resist the temptation to see how far he could go without facing consequences. It was a risky idea, one that would have consequences Jason couldn't even begin to understand. But the thrill of doing something rebellious, of testing boundaries, was too powerful for him to ignore. So Jason, filled with excitement, took action. He had managed to get his hands on a machine gun from a local contact, something that seemed like the ultimate prop for his daredevil stunt. With the weapon in hand, he made his way back to the palace. His heart raced as he approached the royal guards. They stood stoically, as they always did, seemingly oblivious to the danger approaching them. Jason wasn't planning to shoot anyone, of course. He didn't even have a plan beyond the immediate attention he would get by aiming the gun at one of the guards. But to him, it felt like a game that would make his time in the country unforgettable. He had no idea how wrong he was about the seriousness of the situation. With a smile of excitement, Jason raised the machine gun and pointed it directly at one of the royal guards. For a split second, time seemed to stop. Jason's heart beat faster, and the world around him seemed to blur as he realized what he had just done. He had crossed a line that, to his surprise, he hadn't fully understood. He was about to find out just how much danger he was really. At that moment, the palace guards were no longer just soldiers. They were a force of discipline and protection, and they would not tolerate such reckless behavior. Jason had unknowingly made the most dangerous mistake of his life, and he had no idea that his foolish stunt would lead to a life-altering chain of events. The moment Jason pointed the machine gun at the royal guard, time seemed to freeze. He felt a rush of adrenaline coursing through his veins as he watched the guard's unmoving stance, It was as though the whole world had gone silent, and it was just him and the guard in the center of everything. For a moment, Jason felt invincible, as if he were in control of the situation. His fingers were tightly gripped around the weapon, and his mind raced with the thought of what he would say, what he would do, after the guard reacted. But the guard didn't react the way Jason expected. Instead of moving or showing any signs of panic, the royal guard remained still, his eyes scanning Jason carefully. The calmness of the guard was unsettling. Jason had expected to see some hint of fear or surprise, but all he saw was focus. The guard's discipline was extraordinary, and Jason realized too late that his idea had backfired. The excitement he once felt began to fade, replaced by a sense of unease. Within seconds, the scene that Jason thought would be an exciting moment quickly turned into a chaotic one. From the corner of his eye, Jason noticed movement. He hadn't seen it coming. More guards, a few of them running towards him from different directions. They were swift, efficient, and trained to act in situations like this. The guards weren't about to let someone point a weapon at them without responding, especially not in the heart of a palace, where everything was taken so seriously. Jason's heart pounded in his chest as he realized the magnitude of what he had done. His legs felt heavy, as though they were frozen in place, unable to move. The thrill he had once felt was now replaced with fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of the consequences that were surely going to follow. He had crossed a line that he couldn't simply step back from. This wasn't some harmless prank anymore. He had made a decision that could change the course of his life. One of the guards, a tall man with a stern expression, quickly moved in front of Jason and held his hand out. Without any hesitation, he placed a firm grip on the machine gun, forcing it from Jason's hands. Jason stood there, utterly frozen, unable to comprehend how quickly things had escalated. His fingers still tingled from the pressure he had put on the gun, but it was now out of his grasp, and there was no going back. Within moments, Jason was surrounded. He could see other guards moving toward him, their expressions cold and unreadable. They weren't shouting at him, but their presence was intimidating, like a wall of stone closing in around him. He could feel the weight of their gaze, the sense that they knew exactly what had happened, and that there was no room for excuses. His stunt had put everyone at risk, and they weren't going to let it slide. Jason's mind raced. Should he try to explain? Should he beg for mercy? But what could he say? How could he explain his actions? He was just a tourist, a stranger in a foreign land, doing something that was foolish and reckless. He had no real reason for what he had done, no grand purpose, no understanding of the consequences. It was just a moment of rashness, of wanting attention and excitement. But now, standing in the face of these trained guards, he realized just how serious the situation was. As the guards began to speak to him in a calm but firm tone, Jason felt the weight of their words sink in. They weren't threatening him with words, but it was clear they were taking him seriously. He was in deep trouble, and there was no escaping it. His stunt, his impulsive decision, had led to something far beyond what he had imagined. Jason was quickly handcuffed, and as they led him away, he couldn't help but feel a sense of disbelief. How had his simple desire for adventure turned into a nightmare? It was too late for second thoughts now. He had acted without thinking, and now he would have to face the consequences. Little did Jason know, the worst was yet to come. The situation was far from over, and he was about to experience the full weight of the country's strict laws. Jason's world had shifted in an instant. One moment, he had been standing in the midst of the royal palace grounds, feeling confident and ready to capture a moment of excitement. The next, he was handcuffed, surrounded by guards who showed no hint of sympathy. As they led him away, Jason's mind was clouded with confusion and fear. He had been so sure that what he was doing was harmless, a simple prank or thrill-seeking moment. But now, in the grip of the palace guards, he realized just how far he had gone. The guards were silent as they escorted him through the palace grounds, their eyes focused ahead with the kind of determination that came from years of training. Jason tried to break free of the confusion, to understand what was happening. He wanted to say something, to explain that he didn't mean any harm, but the words just wouldn't come. How could he explain the unexplainable? How could he make them understand that he had only wanted a story to tell, not the terrifying reality he now faced? The journey to the local police station was a blur. Jason's hands were tightly secured behind his back, and each step he took felt heavier than the last. He barely noticed the curious looks of the locals as they passed by. Some stared in disbelief, others whispered amongst themselves, but none dared to intervene. Jason was a foreigner, a stranger who had crossed a line that no one could ignore, least of all the royal guards. Once inside the station, Jason was placed in a small, cold cell. The door clanged shut with a sound that echoed in his ears. He sat down on the hard bench, still trying to make sense of the situation. What had he done? Was it really as bad as it seemed? In his mind, he had just taken a picture with a gun, not intending any harm. He hadn't even considered that this could be a serious offense. But now, as the gravity of the situation settled on him, he realized just how much danger he had put himself in. Hours passed, though it felt like days. Jason had no idea what was happening outside of his small, windowless cell. His thoughts were a whirlwind of panic and regret. He had come to this country seeking excitement, but he hadn't thought about the consequences. He hadn't thought about how seriously the royal guards took their duty, how seriously the country took its traditions and security. What had seemed like a harmless thrill was now a nightmare, and there was no easy way out. At some point, a door opened, and Jason was escorted out of his cell. His legs felt weak, his head spinning. He was led into a small interrogation room, where a stern-looking officer sat behind a desk. The officer's gaze was unwavering as he motioned for Jason to sit. Jason did so, feeling a lump form in his throat. The officer wasted no time. "You understand why you're here, don't you?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. Jason nodded, though he wasn't sure if he really did. "You pointed a weapon at a royal guard. A machine gun, no less. You've made a serious mistake." Jason swallowed hard, but the officer wasn't waiting for an answer. Instead, he continued, outlining the laws that Jason had broken. "This isn't just a prank. You put the life of a royal guard in danger, and by doing so, you've threatened the safety of our entire nation." The words stung more than Jason expected. He had never intended for any of this to happen. He hadn't even understood the severity of the situation when he had taken that machine gun into his hands. The officer paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle in. Jason sat motionless, realizing for the first time the true consequences of his actions. He was no longer the carefree tourist seeking thrills. He was now a criminal facing serious charges in a foreign country. The officer stood up and left the room without another word, leaving Jason to stew in his thoughts. Jason's mind raced, trying to come to terms with the reality of what was happening. He had never been in a situation like this before. There was no easy fix, no way to explain his way out of this mess. What had seemed like an impulsive mistake was now a matter of national security, and the penalty for such an offense could be severe. As the minutes ticked by, Jason realized just how trapped he was. There would be no quick escape, no simple resolution. His reckless decision had put him in the hands of a justice system he knew little about, and all he could do now was wait for what would come next. The days passed slowly for Jason as he sat in his small cell, each moment feeling like an eternity. He had no idea what was going to happen to him, and the uncertainty weighed heavily on his mind. His thoughts swirled with regret, frustration, and confusion. How had he let things get so out of hand? All he had wanted was a little excitement, a way to make his trip unforgettable. Now, he found himself facing consequences he hadn't even considered. Jason had been through a lot in his life. He had traveled to many countries, faced different challenges, and always managed to escape unscathed. But nothing had prepared him for the situation he was in now. In his previous travels, there had always been a sense of freedom. He was never held accountable for his actions in any significant way. But this time, things were different. The laws in this country were strict, and it was clear that they were not about to let his reckless behavior slide. As Jason sat on the hard bench in his cell, he thought about the royal guards. He had seen them in countless pictures, standing tall and unmoving, like statues guarding the palace. He had admired their discipline from afar, never considering how seriously they took their job. The reality of their role had only dawned on him when he stood before them, foolishly pointing a gun in their direction. He had underestimated their training, their commitment to protecting the royal family and the country. And now he was paying the price. The next few days were filled with meetings with lawyers, authorities, and interrogators. Jason's defense team tried to make sense of the situation, hoping to find a way to lessen his punishment. They argued that he hadn't intended to harm anyone, that it had been a moment of poor judgment, a spur-of-the-moment decision fueled by curiosity. But no one seemed to care about his intentions. The fact remained that he had threatened the life of a royal guard, and in this country, that was a grave offense. Jason found himself sitting in a cold, sterile courtroom, his heart racing as he waited for the trial to begin. He had never been in a courtroom before, let alone one where his actions were considered a threat to national security. He was surrounded by strangers, people who looked at him with a mixture of disbelief and disdain. He had no idea what they thought of him, but he could feel the weight of their judgment pressing down on him. The trial began, and Jason's nerves only grew stronger. The prosecutor was relentless, focusing on the severity of Jason's actions. He emphasized that Jason's behavior had not only endangered the life of a royal guard, but had also threatened the security of the entire nation. The prosecution painted a picture of a reckless tourist who had no respect for the laws or traditions of the country. Jason, on the other hand, sat silently, unsure of how to defend himself. He knew he couldn't undo what he had done, but he also didn't want to be seen as some kind of villain. When it was his turn to speak, Jason stumbled over his words. He had practiced his defense in his head, but now that he was actually sitting in front of the judge, everything seemed to slip away. "I never meant to harm anyone," he said, his voice shaky. "It was a mistake. I wasn't thinking clearly. I just wanted to get a reaction, to experience something exciting, but I didn't understand how serious it was. I'm sorry." The judge listened quietly, his expression unreadable. Jason could see the skepticism in the eyes of the jury, the silent judgment that seemed to hang in the air. There was no sympathy in the room, only the cold weight of the law. Jason's words seemed to fall flat, as though they carried no real meaning in the face of the charges against him. As the trial continued, Jason's lawyers fought to lessen his punishment. They pointed out his clean record, his lack of any criminal history, and his lack of intent to harm anyone. But the defense was weak, and the prosecution's case was strong. The country's laws were strict, and the court wasn't inclined to show mercy, especially when it came to matters of national security. The trial dragged on for what felt like weeks, each day blurring into the next. Jason was no longer just a tourist. He was now the defendant in a high-profile case. His actions had caught the attention of the media, and the story of the reckless tourist who pointed a gun at a royal guard had spread far and wide. People from all over the world were watching, some criticizing his stupidity, others defending him. But none of it mattered in the courtroom. The judge and jury were focused on one thing: the severity of his crime. By the end of the trial, Jason felt like a man who had lost everything. He had come to this country looking for adventure, seeking excitement, but instead, he had found himself trapped in a nightmare of his own making. He had no idea what the verdict would be, but he couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to change forever. The world he had known, the carefree attitude he had always held, seemed so far away now. In its place was a harsh reality, one that Jason had never imagined in his wildest dreams. The day of the verdict finally arrived, and Jason couldn't escape the heavy weight that had settled on his chest. The long, exhausting trial had led to this moment, a moment he both feared and anticipated. He had spent the last few days trying to prepare himself for whatever outcome awaited him, but deep down, he wasn't sure if he was ready. The walls of the courtroom felt like they were closing in on him, and the air was thick with tension. Every eye in the room was focused on him, the man who had become the center of a high-profile case. Jason sat silently in his seat, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. His defense team had done their best to argue on his behalf. They had pointed out that he had no criminal history, that he had simply made a terrible mistake out of a moment of misguided curiosity. They had even brought up his clean record, hoping to convince the judge to show leniency. But no matter how many arguments they presented, the gravity of the situation weighed heavily on everyone involved. The prosecutor had made it clear that Jason's actions were not only dangerous, but a direct challenge to the country's security and its traditions. Jason glanced over at the prosecutor, whose serious expression had never faltered throughout the trial. He couldn't help but feel a sense of dread whenever the prosecutor spoke. The man's words had been calculated and sharp, each one designed to paint Jason as reckless and irresponsible. Jason's defense team, on the other hand, had tried to appeal to the court's sense of understanding. They had emphasized that Jason had never intended to harm anyone, that it had been a foolish mistake that he deeply regretted. But the prosecutor's case had been too strong, and Jason began to doubt if his defense would be enough. The judge entered the courtroom, and the room fell silent. Jason's heart raced as he straightened up in his seat. The judge's face was unreadable, his expression stern as he surveyed the room. For what seemed like an eternity, the judge didn't say a word. Jason's mind began to race, and he could feel his palms growing sweaty. He had never been in a situation like this before, and the tension in the room felt unbearable. Finally, the judge spoke. His voice was calm but firm as he addressed the court. "This is a serious matter," the judge began, his eyes scanning the room. "A foreigner has come into our country and disregarded our laws, placing our royal guard, and by extension, the safety of our nation, in jeopardy. While the defendant may not have had malicious intent, the consequences of his actions cannot be ignored." Jason swallowed hard, the judge's words hitting him like a cold wave. He knew what was coming next, but hearing it spoken aloud made it all the more real. The judge went on to explain that, while Jason had no criminal record and had expressed remorse, the law had to be upheld. This country values its traditions, and any action that threatens those traditions must be met with a strong response. Jason's mind raced as the judge continued, but his thoughts were jumbled, barely able to grasp the meaning of the words being spoken. His eyes drifted to his lawyers, who looked resigned. There was no pleading left, no final attempt at leniency. The judge had made up his mind. Then the judge made his final statement. "For the seriousness of the crime committed and the potential danger posed, the defendant is hereby sentenced to life imprisonment." Jason's heart seemed to stop. The words echoed in his ears, and for a moment, he couldn't process what he had just heard. Life imprisonment. The phrase sounded so final that it was hard to believe it applied to him. A deep silence filled the courtroom as Jason tried to grasp the enormity of the sentence. His thoughts raced, his mind refusing to accept what had just been declared. Life imprisonment. He had come here to experience something exciting, to add a thrilling story to his collection of adventures. But now, it seemed like that desire for adventure had turned into a nightmare that he could not escape. The gavel came down with a sharp sound, and the judge's words felt like a hammer striking the final nail in his fate. Jason's body went numb, and for a moment, he didn't know if he could move. He wanted to speak, to beg for mercy, but his voice caught in his throat. What could he say now? The consequences of his actions were irreversible. The harshness of the sentence settled on him like a weight he could not lift. As the courtroom slowly emptied, Jason was led away in handcuffs. The reporters outside had already begun to take their pictures, capturing the moment of his downfall. He tried to ignore the cameras and the whispers as he was escorted back to his cell. His world had shrunk to nothing more than the cold, sterile walls of the prison. Jason couldn't stop thinking about the life he had just thrown away. He had come to this country looking for excitement, for something unforgettable, but now it felt as though his life was slipping through his fingers. Life imprisonment. The reality of it hit him hard. He would never again be the carefree traveler, hopping from one adventure to the next. The excitement he had once craved now seemed so far away, replaced by the overwhelming silence of his new life behind bars. The days after the verdict were the hardest Jason had ever faced. The world outside the prison walls felt like a distant memory, something he could no longer touch or even imagine clearly. He had once lived a life full of freedom and adventure, hopping from one country to the next, chasing experiences with little care for consequences. But now, as he sat in the small, cold cell that had become his new reality, everything had changed. The weight of his sentence seemed to grow heavier with each passing hour. At first, Jason couldn't believe it. He kept telling himself that somehow this was all a mistake. Surely, someone would see that he didn't mean any harm, that he was just a tourist who got caught up in a moment of foolishness. But every time he tried to convince himself that things would get better, the harsh reality of the situation came crashing back. Life imprisonment. It wasn't just a sentence. It was a complete loss of everything he had known. His days of exploring the world were gone, replaced by the routine of prison life. The first few weeks in prison were the toughest. Jason felt completely out of place. The other inmates were hardened individuals, with a life of crime and tough decisions behind them. Jason was different. He was an outsider, someone who had made a mistake, but in the eyes of those around him, he didn't belong. He kept his head down, trying to blend in as much as possible, but it wasn't easy. Every interaction felt like a reminder of how far he had fallen. The guards, too, made sure to remind him of his place. They treated him with a cold indifference, making it clear that he was now just another prisoner, subject to the same rules as everyone else. At times, Jason wondered if the other prisoners saw him as weak. After all, he wasn't a criminal in the traditional sense. He wasn't like the others, with a long list of offenses to his name. But to them, it didn't matter. In their eyes, he was just as guilty as anyone else, someone who had crossed a line that could not be undone. It wasn't long before Jason's thoughts turned inward. There was no one to talk to, no one who could understand what he was going through. He was isolated in a way that he had never experienced before. The excitement he once sought had turned into a prison of its own. But over time, Jason began to realize that this isolation was his punishment. He would have to live with the consequences of his actions, no matter how hard that was to accept. Still, Jason didn't give up. He refused to let the weight of his situation completely crush him. Slowly, he started to adapt to life behind bars. The routines of prison became a new kind of normal, though it felt suffocating at times. He did his best to stay out of trouble, to avoid any more conflict, and to simply get through the days. Sometimes, he would sit in the corner of his cell, staring out at the gray walls, lost in thought. Other times, he would try to read or write, hoping to keep his mind sharp and his memories of the outside world alive. Over time, he also began to reflect on the choices that had led him to this point. He thought about his desire for adventure, about how he had taken risks without considering the consequences. What had seemed like a harmless thrill had led to the loss of his freedom, and he couldn't undo it. He had always thought of himself as someone who could get away with anything, someone who could escape the consequences, but now he knew better. There were some actions that couldn't be undone. Jason's thoughts often turned to the Royal Guard, the one he had pointed the machine gun at. He wondered how that guard felt, what he thought when Jason had crossed that line. Jason didn't know much about the guard's life, but he knew that the man was just doing his job, protecting something important. In a strange way, Jason had gained a new respect for those who protected the things they believed in, even if it meant making tough decisions. As weeks turned into months, Jason's life began to take on a new rhythm. He didn't feel the same rush of excitement he had once sought, but there was a quiet acceptance that he had to learn to live with. He realized that he would never be able to go back to the life he had before, that the adventure he had wanted was now something he could never touch again. The price of his mistake had been steep, but it was the only reality he had now. In the silence of his cell, Jason made a promise to himself. He would find a way to make this time count. He would reflect on his past, learn from it, and try to find peace in a place where it seemed impossible to find. It wasn't the future he had imagined, but it was the one he had to face. And in that acceptance, Jason began the long journey of trying to rebuild his life, piece by piece, behind the bars that held him. As the months stretched on, Jason's life inside the prison became an endless cycle of routine. The walls around him, once intimidating and alien, had begun to feel strangely familiar. Each day, he followed the same steps, waking up early, attending the roll call, eating the same simple meals, and then spending his time in the same small, concrete cell. At first, every minute felt like an eternity, but now, Jason had learned to exist within the walls of his prison. He didn't like it, but it was his reality, and slowly he began to adapt. The isolation, which had been so difficult in the beginning, no longer felt as oppressive. At times, Jason even welcomed the silence. The prison was a place filled with noise, guards shouting, the clang of doors opening and closing, the murmurs of other prisoners. But in his small corner of the world, he had learned to find peace. It was a strange kind of peace, but it was his. He began to spend his days reflecting, thinking about everything that had brought him here. There was little else to do, and he had nothing but time to examine his past. Jason had come to realize that the reckless, thrill-seeking behavior that had once defined him was what had led him into this mess. He had always chased excitement, never thinking about the consequences. He'd wanted to prove something to himself, to others, to the world. Maybe that he was brave or fearless. Maybe that he could get away with things that no one else would dare to try. But now, in the quiet of his cell, Jason understood the cost of that mindset. The thrill of adventure had blinded him to the reality of his actions, and it had cost him everything. Over time, Jason began to change. He started to focus on the small things, something he had never really done before. The feel of the pen as it moved across the paper when he wrote letters to his family. The faint smell of the meals that came through the bars of his cell. The rare moments when a guard would offer him a glance or a nod, acknowledging his existence. They were small things, but they became important. It was all he had. Jason also began to read. He had never been a huge reader before, but now books became a window to a world outside the prison. He devoured anything he could get his hands on. Novels, biographies, even history books. Reading became his escape, a way to forget the four walls that surrounded him, if only for a short time. With every page, he felt himself connecting to something larger than his circumstances. It wasn't just the stories or the lessons in the books. It was the idea that there was still a world out there, a world that he was once a part of. It wasn't gone, and neither was he. One day, while he was in the prison library, Jason came across a book about the country's history and its royal traditions. He felt an odd sense of curiosity. The royal palace, the guards, the events that had led to his arrest. He had never really taken the time to understand the significance of all of it. He had been so focused on himself, on his own desires and thrill-seeking behavior, that he hadn't thought about the world around him. Now, as he read about the monarchy's history, about the respect and reverence the royal family commanded, Jason realized just how much he had underestimated the country he had visited. It wasn't just a place for adventure. It was a land with deep roots, traditions that mattered to its people. Jason began to feel a sense of humility that had been missing in his earlier life. It wasn't about regret or self-pity. It was more about understanding. He understood now that his actions had been more than just a foolish prank. He had disrespected something important, something sacred to the people of this country. And while he couldn't change what had happened, he could at least learn from it. As the months turned into years, Jason's mindset began to shift. He was no longer the young man who had come to this country looking for a thrill. He was a man who had learned the cost of his mistakes. He had learned that some actions couldn't be undone, and that sometimes the consequences were far more severe than you could ever imagine. But through the isolation, the reflection, and the quiet days spent reading and writing, Jason began to rebuild. It wasn't the life he had wanted, but it was a life he was determined to make meaningful. He would never forget the mistakes he had made, but he could choose how he moved forward. Jason still thought about the outside world, about the friends and family he had left behind. He thought about the places he would never see again, the experiences he would never have. But in the quiet of his cell, he found something he hadn't expected: peace. It was a slow process, one that came with time and effort, but Jason had found a way to accept his fate. He had no control over the past, but he still had a future, and that was something worth holding on to. Life in prison wasn't easy, and it would never be what Jason had imagined. But in the strange confines of his new world, he had found something valuable: an understanding of himself, and the realization that even in the darkest places, there was room for growth. Years passed, and the man who had once arrived in the country full of pride and excitement was no longer the same. Jason had changed in ways that he couldn't have imagined when he first stepped into that foreign land, eager to test the boundaries of his own thrill-seeking desires. He had entered the prison a reckless, impulsive traveler. And now, years later, he was a man who understood the weight of consequences. He had found himself in a place he never expected, but somehow he had also found a part of himself that he hadn't known existed. Over the course of his time in prison, Jason had learned to find meaning in the small things: the sound of the rain against the bars of his cell, the quiet moments spent reading a book or writing letters. Even the daily routine of prison life had become a part of his existence. At first, everything had felt like a punishment, a loss of freedom. But over time, Jason realized that he could still control how he lived, even within the walls of the prison. He spent his days working on his own personal growth, trying to learn from his past mistakes and find peace within himself. The anger and frustration he had once felt had slowly melted away, replaced with an acceptance of his situation. Jason had no illusions about the future. He knew he would never walk out of the prison with the same freedom he had once taken for granted. But he also knew that he could choose how he spent his days. He had learned to stop fighting against his circumstances and had started to focus on what he could do, what he could control. During these years, Jason had grown close to a few of the other prisoners, though he remained cautious about who he trusted. He knew that not everyone in the prison was there for the same reasons he was, and he had learned that the lessons he could learn from others were just as valuable as the ones he had learned from his own mistakes. Some of the men around him had committed serious crimes, yet Jason had found that they, too, were capable of change. He listened to their stories, and in doing so, he began to see the complexity of human nature. People weren't just defined by the mistakes they made, but by their ability to grow, to learn from those mistakes, and to try again. Despite his circumstances, Jason had a growing sense of responsibility for his own life. He began to work in the prison library, helping to organize books and assist other prisoners with reading and learning. It wasn't much, but it gave him a sense of purpose, a way to contribute to the world around him, even in the smallest of ways. He had been a man who had once sought nothing more than excitement, but now he found fulfillment in helping others, in providing guidance to those who needed it. The people around him, no matter how different their stories were from his own, became a part of his life. Jason also found solace in his family's letters. His parents, though saddened by the choice he had made, had continued to support him. They wrote him often, encouraging him to stay strong and to keep learning, reminding him that they hadn't given up on him. His sister, too, had sent him letters filled with warmth, sharing news from home, and even telling him about the small moments in life that he had missed. These letters became his lifeline to the world beyond the prison, a reminder that he was still connected to the people who cared about him. Despite everything, Jason never stopped thinking about the past. He thought about the moment he had pointed that gun at the royal guard, about how it had changed everything in an instant. He thought about the lessons he had learned since that fateful day, about the ways he had tried to rebuild himself, and the ways he still struggled. But as time passed, the regret that had once consumed him began to fade, replaced by a quiet determination. He could never change what he had done, but he had learned that he could still shape his future. One quiet evening, as Jason sat in his cell, reading a book about the country's rich history, he realized something profound. The past, with all its mistakes and missteps, had led him to this moment, to this understanding of himself. The prison walls, once a symbol of punishment, had become a space where he could grow, where he could find meaning, even in a life filled with limits. He was no longer the same person who had arrived years ago, seeking adventure without considering the cost. He had become someone who understood that real growth often comes from the hardest places. Jason's journey was far from over. He would never be free in the way he once imagined, but he had found a freedom of a different kind, one that existed in his mind, in his heart, and in his actions. He had learned that sometimes, even when everything seems lost, there is still a chance to rebuild. In the end, it wasn't the adventures or the thrills that mattered most. It was the ability to learn, to grow, and to become a better person, no matter where life took him. And for Jason, that was enough.